All right, well, if that doesn't get you going, I was about to come out dancing and ready to start rapping, but we are in a new series, week one of a series that we are calling Pursuit, a series that has us looking at the unending mercy of God, the unwavering love of God, and the extravagant grace that God pours out and offers out to the lost, to the loved, and to the lukewarm. Shout out to everybody who's joining us online, just tuning in, or with our online campus, downtown campus, Seminole campus, here in the room at Tyrone. You look good, you sound good, glad you're here. Y'all ready for some fun today? All right, some of you ready to kick off this series. We're gonna be camping out in Luke's gospel. So this is in the New Testament, Luke's gospel, chapter 15, and focusing on a parable that Jesus shares about a father and his two sons. A parable being Jesus' go-to method for teaching. A parable is a story. It's a story that Jesus would share to illustrate a point, to make his point, his teaching come to life, and to help reorient and reshape the way in which the people listening understood his teaching, but also understood the world in which they were operating and living in. So a parable isn't like these are the events that took place in the Bible. The parable shared is the event that took place, but it's a story. It's an illustration that Jesus is using. And the parable that Jesus is going to be sharing and that we're looking at throughout this series has three distinct perspectives. We've got the younger son who's run off and he lives recklessly and he becomes lost. We've got the father who is loving and patient and gracious. And then we have the older brother who is steady and obedient, but resentful along the way. Some of you are thinking, I think I know what story, what parable this is. It's often commonly referred to as the parable of the prodigal son. Prodigal meaning reckless, careless. And the primary reason that Jesus is sharing this parable, that he goes on to share this teaching and share this story, is to illustrate his mercy, his grace, and his love for the prodigals, for the folks who have wandered off, perhaps even run off, the ones who have been careless and reckless in their lives, and the ones who we might consider to be too lost, too far gone, and undeserving and unworthy in the eyes of God. And it's this perspective of the reckless runner that we're going to be starting this series off with today, the perspective of the prodigal son, the reckless runner that's going to get us going today. And it's fitting that we're talking about the reckless running today, seeing that we were supposed to have our Mirror Lake 5K run yesterday, had to postpone it because of the rain we were expecting and the rain that we're getting. I know many of you were looking forward to it. We do have a new date that we're going to be sharing with you. So if you didn't register, you can register. Many of you were looking forward to being out there running. Others looking forward to being out there just walking and sharing life with the people around. And then some like me who are looking forward to kicking your feet up with a donut and not running or walking, but talking the entire time, not running. Why? Because I am not a runner. Might be shocking at the look of me. I look like a distance runner, I know, but I'm not a fan of running. I enjoy sports. I need to get back to doing some of those athletic activities, basketball, pickleball, golf. I like hitting the gym, but running for the sake of running, I've told you before, not my jam. And let me tell you why. I feel like I need to defend this, so let me tell you a personal story to explain why. When I was in seminary up in North Carolina, I was talked into participating in an easy 5K. They said it was a fun run. Those two didn't really mix well for me, but that's what they said. It was a fun run. And by talked into running, I mean I was forced into running by my wife, who was running a good 20 to 25 miles a week on the pavement or on the trail in North Carolina. She loved to run. We hung out with those people, the runners, the people who love to get out and run for the sake of running. And so I forced myself by volunteering to get registered for the race and on the starting line with a race bib safety pin to my shirt. That's where I found myself. Now, we all decided to go to this race, to this run as a group, but we were going to run at our own pace. Right? I didn't know that was an option. I was going to run at whatever pace I could make it in. There was no other pace but mine. But I started off strong. And by strong, I mean I started off. I moved forward from the starting line. So I'm running, not too fast, not too slow. Things are good. But it was about a mile in that I started to get some kind of tight pressure and cramp right here, right? A mile in. We're not talking like 10 miles in. We're a mile in. And I'm getting a cramp and I'm starting to feel it. I'm questioning my existence. Why did I sign up for this? Why did I let them talk me into it? And at this point, all the participants in the race are starting to be spread out by now. So the runners, however fast they might be, the ones who are actually running the race, they are ahead, they're out of sight, and the walkers are about the same distance behind me. I'm in no man's land. I'm somewhere in between. The runners are up ahead, the walkers are behind, and I have this cramp, and I've made it 1 mile in, and I make my way to 2 miles. I'm cruising. I'm exhausted. I'm tired. And it's at the 2 mile marker that I see a road work ahead sign on the path. All right? We had been running along these cones. There were lines of orange cones that were keeping the race in line, showing us the course and where we were to go. All of a sudden, after this road work ahead sign, there was a new set of cones, orange cones, the exact same color, the exact same size, blocking the way going down to the utility work. All right, so some orange cones went the race course, and the other orange cones went the work course. Both of them just went down to one side of the lake or the other, and I had to choose. All right, so I'm cruising along. There's no volunteers, there's no workers, there's no signs. I'm cruising along, I'm looking down, I'm running, and I go in the direction that I thought was correct. Key word there being what? Thought. Yeah, I'm cruising, about 100 yards in, I end up in a tremendous amount of mud. All right, so I'm thinking, man, this is one of those mud races. I didn't know when I signed up, but my shoes, I'm sinking in. I got mud covered my shoes. It's splattering up my legs. It's everywhere. It had hit my face, so I am looking like I'm really into this mud run, which it wasn't a mud run. But I keep running, I keep going. And after a few minutes of running through the mud, I run up on some construction workers who were out working in what should have been a remote work site. Right? They were just as surprised to see me as I was to see them. I actually startled one of them when I ran up on them as I'm hoofing it in their direction. They're wondering why I'm running on and jogging in this construction site. I'm wondering why I'm running and jogging in this construction site. And it was quite obvious to everyone around at that time that I had gotten lost. I had turned and I'd gone the wrong direction, which meant I had to turn around and make my way back through the mud, right? Back through that mud run, with all the mud on my shoes splattering up on me, and I had to make my way back up to the fork in the road and take the correct path. Friends, why am I sharing this humiliating story with you? Well, it's for two reasons. First of all, it is my excuse for not having registered for the race. I'll think about it for the new date that we have that's coming up. But second, because I think that my fun run experience of veering off course, getting off track, finding myself stuck and uncomfortable in all sorts of mud can sometimes be a lot like our experiences or our perspectives when it comes to our relationship with God. Meaning that for some of us, I'm making an assumption. I'd imagine that some of us in here are tuning in, one of our campuses, or even just people that we know. People know what it's like over the course of our life to discover that we've gotten off track. That there are some of us who understand and know what it means to take an unintentional detour and to go in the wrong direction, realizing that we've gone the wrong way, realizing that we've gotten lost, we're exhausted, and perhaps we're even covered in mud and find ourselves having to turn around and search for a better way. So here's the big question that I want us to start with today, and the big question is this: how could God love the prodigals who have run off and gotten lost? How could God do this? Why? How come? How could God love the prodigals who have run off and gotten lost? How could he extend mercy and grace and love to those people, the ones who are long gone and too far away? How could God welcome the sinner back and in Jesus invite a relationship, forgiving and accepting the people who've been reckless and careless and perhaps covered in mud? Friends, this is the question I want us to start from today because it's the exact same question that Jesus was being confronted with prior to telling this parable of the father and his two sons. You see, right before this parable, right before Jesus is sharing this parable, Jesus is hanging around with this motley crew of outcasts and sinners, tax collectors and sinners. And there is this group of religious leaders off to the side saying, why is Jesus, a Jewish leader, hanging out with these folks that do not follow the Jewish law exactly as they should, and the folks who are reckless and careless and have wandered off and squandered their life away, these sinners? They want to know why Jesus welcomes them, why Jesus accepts them, and they want to know how come. All right, so this is what Jesus goes on to teach in this parable. And picking up in Luke chapter 15, verse 11, Jesus begins the parable of the prodigal son like this. And he said, this is Jesus, and he said, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. So here it's a pretty straightforward intro to the story. We're introduced to a father and his two sons. We're not given any names. We're not given any details. All we know is that the youngest son, the younger of the two brothers, asks his father for the property that was coming to him, his inheritance that would come at the time of his father's death. All right, so this wasn't just like, hey, can I get a little extra cash? This wasn't a cash advance or a way of asking to borrow some money or for his allowance a little bit early. No, basically the younger son comes up to his father and he's saying, I don't need you anymore. You've provided up to this point. I don't care. I want to go my own way. And it's almost like he's saying, you're basically dead to me, Dad. Like I'd be better off if you were not here and I had the inheritance that would be mine as your son. So as you can imagine, this is a disgrace to the father, right? And this is a tremendous form of betrayal, and it's an act that was shameful and dishonorable to the family name, shameful and dishonorable to the father, to the son, and to the entire family name, and all that the father had built for his family. But in Jewish culture, this was also viewed as a disgrace to the entire community. Meaning this wasn't just something that happened to one family that was disconnected from the community and, oh, did you hear about what happened to the Joneses? Like, oh yeah, they're going through it. This is tough. This was a disgrace. This was dishonorable. This was a shameful act to the entire community. And it was reason for the youngest son to be rejected and shunned from this community. Doing what he did meant that he was no longer accepted and he would no longer be able to remain there in the community with them. And he was no longer welcome back. This was shameful. This was a disgrace. And this betrayal permanently cuts ties with the community for good. But how does the father respond in the story? We're told that the father agrees. The father says, okay, if that's what you want, if that's the direction or the path that you want to go, then here you go, take it. The father divides up the inheritance between his two sons, and he gives the younger son his share of the inheritance, graciously giving his son what was undeserving and unearned and not what he wanted him to receive. But Jesus continues the story saying this. We continue like this. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. All right, so the younger son, he starts getting everything together. He gets the cash out of the bank. He puts the title to the truck in his name. He starts selling off his share of the family business, and he grabs all of that money and he puts it in the duffel bag and he gets in the truck and he sets out to live his life, the life he wanted to pursue, the lifestyle that he wanted to move toward. And while he was away, Jesus says that he squandered his property in reckless living. Squandered. It means to waste. He was wasteful. He lost it. He was careless with it. Reckless living, careless, destructive, irresponsible, meaning the son took everything that his father had offered to him, had to offer him and had given him. He takes it all and he wastes everything. He wastes his inheritance on reckless living. Other translations say immoral living. So we oftentimes in reading this or thinking about the prodigal son, we start to fill in the blank. What did he wander off and squander? What did he do? What was this reckless living? Gambling, sex, drugs, rock and roll, bar tabs, VIP lounges, extravagant purchases, any and every worldly pleasure and pursuit you can think of or imaginable. Fill it in. It's this story. Let your imagination come to life. This younger son goes off and he squanders it all the inheritance in reckless living. But listen to what Jesus says next. Jesus continues the story saying this. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. and he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. Eventually, in time, the son who ran off, he loses everything. There's nothing left of the inheritance. There's no more money to take out of the bank. He's been reckless, he's been careless, and now it's all gone, and he's facing the reality of the consequences. And at the same time that the inheritance that he had received all runs out, a famine hits the country. Basically, the economy crashes, and he finds himself in need. Not a care or want or need in the world when he had all that inheritance when he was running off, and then the going gets tough, and he's been wasteful and reckless, and all of a sudden he finds himself in need. And so he ends up getting a job, the only job that he could find, the only one available, working in the fields, working on a farm, and feeding the scraps to the pigs. He took the inheritance, he runs off, he squanders everything, he's reckless, and he finds himself in the mud and in the mess of this pig farm. Listen to what happens next. We're going to keep the narrative going with the story. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger?" It says, but when he came to himself, meaning he finally comes to his senses, as he's feeding the slop to the pigs, as he's feeding the scraps to the pigs, as he's walking and sitting and resting in the mud and he's thinking of his life, he finally comes to his senses. Something clicks. Something begins to change. He has this aha moment, an aha moment of clarity, and he begins thinking about this life that he had abandoned. He starts thinking about this life that he had left behind, the comfort, the care, the love, the resources, the provisions that had been offered to him by his father. And it's like here in this pigsty, slopping around in the mud, that he begins to ask himself, what am I doing? What have I come to? What did I do? Why did I let my life get to this point? And he begins recognizing and acknowledging and admitting his mistakes as he's there in the pig pen. And friends, I want to stop here for a minute, and I want to ask if any of us in here might be able to relate. I'm not asking if you've ever worked on a farm or fed food to pigs, but I'm wondering, is there anyone in here that knows what it's like to have given up something good or to give up something stable to pursue a temporary or fleeting want, wish, or desire? Is there anyone in here who knows what it's like to have lost perspective and to wandered away, maybe wandered off, maybe even run off? Have you ever gotten off course in life, gotten off track and ended up in your own version of a mess? I'd imagine there are folks in here tuning in or people around us that knows what it's like to be like the prodigal, to have had it good or to have it better than we currently do, but to take something for granted and to wander off and to waste it away, having lost perspective. And I wonder if there's anyone here that's ever gotten to one of those points in life. You fill in the blank with your story, with your scenario, your situation, but have you ever asked the question, why did I do this? How did I let it get to this? How did I get here? What have I done and why? How did I let it go this far? There's moments when you realize that you've squandered a situation, that you've been reckless with your decisions or messed up, that you've wasted all sorts of time, that maybe you have drained all sorts of resources, and maybe even strained all sorts of relationships. I'd imagine there are folks who can relate to what's happening here in this story. But I have two more questions, and I think these next two questions are actually more important than the first. Let me ask you the first one. What was your perspective of yourself in those moments? When you ran off, when you wandered off, when you ran away, maybe it started off strong, but then you found yourself covered in mud and you're wondering, what have I come to? Why did I do this? How did you view yourself? What was your perspective of yourself in that moment? And then probably the more important question of the two, did that influence your view or your perspective of God in any way? How did you view yourself when you're the prodigal? What was your perspective of who you were and your worth and and what you deserved and what you had come to? And did your perspective of yourself start to shift to what you thought the Father, God the Father, thinks or thought of you? You see, the truth is, it's in those moments of guilt and shame that it can be easy for us to let our thoughts, our assumptions, and our perspectives, or other people's thoughts, assumptions, and perspectives influence the ways that we think God sees us. Meaning the way we see us, the names we call ourselves, the things that we believe that we have come to, we start to think that's how God sees us, that's how God views us. And in doing so, we can end up letting the weight of our mistakes, the weight of our guilt and our disappointment and our shame and our flaws overshadow the grace, the mercy, and the love of God. We can allow that guilt and that shame and that regret that we're holding on to muddy our sense of self-worth in the eyes of God. Friends, this is what's happening with the younger son in the story. He's not just going through a rough patch. He's not just down on his luck. He's at the bottom. He's at his version of rock bottom. He's run out of money. He has no other options. He's messed up relationships, strained relationships. There are no more moves to make. And all of this perspective of the prodigal, it starts to become clear with what he plans on doing next. Jesus continues saying this. The youngest son in the story says, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He plans on going back and saying, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And Jesus says, and he arose and he came to his father, carrying a tremendous amount of guilt and shame and this deep, deep sense of unworthiness. The son begins to plan his difficult and lengthy and challenging journey back home. He's finally ready and prepared to face the reality of his consequences, and he's not expecting to be welcomed back by anyone, not his older brother, not the people around him, his neighbors, and especially not his father. He even has an apology speech all kind of written out and planned, and he's ready. He's rehearsed it. He's going to go back home, and he's surrendered to the reality that he is no longer worthy to be called his father's son. Why? Based solely on his decisions. Based solely on his disobedience and his actions and his disgrace and his dishonor and his taking what was not his at the time, but demanding it, running off, being reckless, and squandering it. He believes all of that, his history, his baggage, his past, does not make him worthy to be called his father's son. And so with this perspective on his mind, the prodigal begins to make his way back home, returning to the father, and listen to what happens next. Jesus goes on saying this. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. But while he was still a long way off. Do you know what that long way off in the Greek means? Long way off. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Think about this scene for just a moment. Think about this reunion. Think about this story that Jesus is illustrating here and what has taken place. After dishonoring his father and disgracing his family's reputation, the father was where? Right there waiting. After years, possibly, of careless decisions and reckless living, the father never once turned away. The father never gave up on his son. The father never gave up on the hope or the possibility that his son, his wayward son, his prodigal son, just might return home. And Jesus says, while he was still a far way off, a long way off, his father sees him coming and he's filled with compassion, so much so that he drops everything and he begins running off, racing off, eager to get to his son, to embrace him, to wrap his arms around him and give him a kiss and welcome his son back home. Friends, this is a powerful, powerful story parable where Jesus is equating his love and his mercy and his grace to that of the loving and gracious Father in the parable. A Father who never turns away, who never gives up hope, who never stops looking, never stops waiting, and is always ready to extend compassion and mercy and grace in an extravagant way when we make the decision to stop running, squandering, and being reckless in the mud, and to turn back and come to him. But friends, do you know what stands out to me in this story, at least in the story that we've read up to this part in the parable? It has to do with why Jesus is sharing this parable in the first place. Do you remember why I told you? He's sharing this because there's some religious leaders who are wondering why. Why does he welcome the lost? Why does he welcome sinners? Why does he allow the prodigals to come back? And why does he extend mercy and grace and love and accept and eat and hang with those kind of people? That's what they're asking. And the reason Jesus shares this parable is to explain why. But friends, at no point in this story, at least as I've read it and reread it and looked at it before, at no point in this story does Jesus provide a detailed explanation, a reason, or an argument as to why. He doesn't provide any explanation of why the Father continues to love his Son. There's no explanation, there's no details, there's no reason, there's no argument as to why the Father never quits looking for him, never stops waiting on him, and why the Father is filled with that much compassion, why his heart is just completely turned that much toward forgiveness toward his Son that he runs off to embrace his Son and to welcome him back home. There's no explanation why. Instead, Jesus simply tells a story where the Father does. All that Jesus focuses on in this story was how the Father responds and what the Father does to demonstrate his love and his grace and his mercy toward his Son when he returns. Which means if we're looking at this, week one of this series is the prodigal. Next week is the father, and then the following week is the older son. We're looking at it from the perspective of the prodigal, right? The reckless runner, the runaway. But it means that the father's actions toward the prodigal is significant. The Father's actions toward the prodigal is significant for us to step into the shoes of the prodigal or to understand this story from the eyes and the perspective of the prodigal, because it appears the Father's actions are what justify and explain why Jesus has a tremendous amount of mercy and love and grace for the prodigals and for the lost, any more than any word or description of why could ever do. And here's why. Let's look at the actions. In Middle Eastern cultures, a father, the head of the household, would never run. Sidebar, that's why I don't run. It's not biblical, right? That's for another day, another time. Back to the story. In Middle Eastern cultures, and continues today, a father would not be caught running. To do so would be shocking and undignified. And it would require him to lift up his robe, right, to get the robe above his knees so that he could actually run off. We're told that he races off. He would have to pull the robe up and expose his knees, expose his legs. In doing that, exposing your skin and your legs, that was also considered to be a shameful and disgraceful act for men to do. Men did not run, and they did not show their legs by tying up the robe and running off, which he would have had to do. And what happens in this story? That's exactly what the Father does. He had to have tied up his robe above his knees and race off, because he does. He races off. He runs to greet his Son while he was still a long way off. And friends, you want to know the only logical reason as to why the Father would do this? Why the Father would risk his reputation for his undeserving Son's reputation? Why he would bring disgrace upon himself for his Son's disgraceful actions? It's so that the Father could get to his Son before the community around him could get to him. So you always think of this as like a field where the Father is like running through the fields, but think of a city. He sees him on the outskirts of the city or all the way down the street, and the Father races off through the city, through the streets as the neighbors, before the neighbors could see him coming into town. He runs off while he is still a long way off so that the others will not get to him before he does. It's so that the Father could get to his Son before the Son experienced the shame and the guilt and the judgment and the punishment for all the wrong that he had done and all the disgrace that he had brought upon himself, his family's name, and the entire community. You see, by running off and embracing his son, the father takes everyone's focus off of the prodigal son. By racing through the community, by running to get to him while he was still a long way off, the father takes the focus off of the disobedience and the disrespect and the reckless living that his son, who was coming back, had done, and he puts all of the focus, all of the perspective, everyone around is not looking at the son. They shift their focus and their perspective on to him. It was the father's extravagant demonstration of love and grace that protects his son from getting the judgment that was coming to him and running ahead to his son while he was still a long way off. The father takes on that lowly and dishonorable position himself, exposing his legs and running through the community. And he does so to absorb the shame and the dishonor and the disgrace that was intended and meant for his son. The father brings it all upon himself. An unthinkable, shocking, and inconceivable demonstration of grace that takes the place of and overshadows the weight of the prodigal's disgrace. And friends, if you're wondering, the same demonstration of unexplainable, shocking, and extravagant grace has been done for each and every one of us too. And it was demonstrated to us by Jesus' sacrifice that was made for us on our behalf on the cross. Friends, it was on the cross that Jesus demonstrates this unimaginable and shocking and incomprehensible act of grace. And Jesus, being filled with compassion and forgiveness, takes on the guilt, takes on the shame and the judgment and the disgrace that we deserve because of our sin and that we should have received and should have been placed on us. And he takes it on himself and places the weight on himself. God's extravagant demonstration of grace for us on the cross takes the weight and the judgment and the burden and the consequences of our sin, and the focus is no longer on who we are, what we've done, how far we've gone, and how much mud we've picked up along the way. The focus is then placed on Jesus Christ on the cross. Amen? Here's the big idea. The extravagance of God's grace overshadows the weight of our disgrace. The extravagance of God's grace overshadows the weight of our disgrace, regardless of our past decisions, our regrets, our mistakes, regardless of the careless and destructive ways that we've gone about and been about, regardless of the disobedience and the reckless ways that we've lived our lives, in spite of the mud that we have picked up along the way, and in spite of the mud that we might have slung onto other people along the way. The extravagance of God's grace as demonstrated to us by what Jesus did for us on the cross, it overshadows, takes the place of, and takes all of the focus of our disgrace. Let me go back to that fun run that I was telling you about, because I never told you how it finished. And obviously I did, because I'm here, standing on 2 feet, taking nourishment today. I made it through. Things were good. I eventually got to the top of the hill where the divide went. I got back on the right path. And at this point, I am exhausted. I am tired, I'm sweaty, and I'm covered in mud, right? I've gone through the mud. I had to turn around and go back through the mud. So here I am covered in mud, and I'm trying to make up for lost time and all of that wasted energy. But it was about 10 or 12 minutes after I'd gone off course. So by the time I get back on the right path, all of the people who are walking are the people that I'm running next to, right? So all the walkers that were way behind me after my muddy detour, they had caught up to me, and they had this concerned look on me because they were barely breathing, just kind of walking, feeling good, like not a care in the world. And I am hoofing it. I am making sounds that a human being is not supposed to be making. I can barely catch my breath. I'm sweaty, I'm exhausted, and I have mud all over me as I make this final lap for the mile, making this final loop around to take the final mile of the race. Now, all my friends at this point, they'd finished, right? They're probably back 25 minutes prior to me coming around the corner. And my wife reminded me after the last service, she was sitting in here. I said, we all signed up for the 5K, remember? Just like I told you. She said, actually, we ran a 10K, you ran a 5K, and I was 6 months pregnant when I ran. I said, I don't need to know. The story still stands. So my pregnant wife who'd run a 10K, well, I'm barely making it through a 5K. They're all back. They're at the finish line. I come rounding this corner, around these trees, and as soon as I come around the corner, they see me and I see them, all right? So cue the Chariots of Fire music. Right? Picture this in slow motion, because it was. This is about how fast I was running. I'm booking it. I look like I'm in a movie running to the helicopter after weeks of military combat, covered in mud, running. It's that kind of movie scene, slow motion, mud and sweat and a few tears at this point. I'm questioning everything, my existence, God's existence, and my friends who I see at the finish line, they're absolutely beside themselves. They are cheering like they have never cheered anyone on before. They are shouting with excitement. It might have been relief that they didn't have to call a rescue mission and try and come and save me. But they are beside themselves as if I'm about to cross the finish line and win a gold medal in an Olympic event. I can see them cheering, celebrating, and they're just looking straight at me. But listen, except for the friends and my wife, they were there at the finish line who had all their eyes focused on me. Do you know where everybody else's attention was focused on in that moment? What I was looking at, what all the race organizers and volunteers and people who had already finished, where everybody was looking, let me give you a hint. It was not on me. It wasn't on this sweaty, huffing and puffing monster covered in mud who had gone astray, gotten off track, and gotten lost in the mud. As I got closer and closer to that finish line, everybody's eyes, including mine, were on the wild and crazy celebrations of my friends and my wife who were at the finish line. No one was looking at me wondering, where had he been? What took him so long? Why is he covered in all of that mud? All the people could focus on and all I could focus on was the celebration of the ones who were there ready to welcome me back and receive me. And friends, I believe that this is the perspective that we're to hang on to, whether we're the prodigals or we have the prodigals in our lives at this time. It doesn't matter how lost we feel. Whether we've been sprinting through life or crawling through life or that sprint, jog, walk, somewhere in between. It doesn't matter how lost we feel, how far we've gone. It doesn't matter how much mud we've picked up along the way. And the shame and the guilt and the disappointment and the stories and all of the path. It doesn't matter. When we decide to stop wandering and recklessly living and kind of squandering our lives through the mud, when we decide to stop and to turn around and make our way back to the Father, friends, the focus is not on the path that we took in the mud and the details. The focus is not placed on us. It's about the one who receives us. And the extravagant work and celebration and the mercy and the love and the grace that God extends and offers to us when we turn around, recognizing the work that has been done for us in Jesus Christ, and we begin to make our way to him. What he does in that moment and where the focus is in that moment isn't about us, even though we want it to be, and we make it sometimes. It's about the mercy and the grace and the love of God who runs, and I mean runs, races to meet us, even if we're still a long way off, embraces us, pulls us in, gives us a kiss and says, I love you. Welcome home. Friends, for the wanderers, for the runners, for the reckless, God's always waiting. God doesn't force himself upon us, but he longs to be wanted, and he waits for us to return. And when we do, all of our attention, all of our focus should be on the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness that he's extended to you in Jesus Christ. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. God, there's some in here today who are prodigals. There are others who are connected to the prodigals. The truth is, there are times in our lives where we run off, we wander away, or maybe we just turn away. And our imperfections and our mistakes and our regrets, it's so easy to let the weight of our consequences and the shame and the guilt that we carry get in the way. And I pray that we wouldn't hold on to a cheap grace where we just dismiss the consequences. But I pray that we wouldn't miss out on the overwhelming and extravagant grace that you offer when we're ready to turn around and to come back home, seeing and trusting and believing in the work that's been done for us in Jesus. God, for the runners, for the wanderers, for the lost and the reckless, may we know that we have an invitation and a place to be welcomed back home, and that's through the sacrificial work that's been done for us in Jesus. May we receive it, may we embrace it, and may we return home. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.